So thanks for coming. This is joint work with Hoyt. So this is a picture by de Beaumont of the Ohio River from the Yale Archives. So there's been a lot of work on slavery. In the past, historians, or some historians, thought that it was an inefficient, unprofitable institution. About 60 years ago, economists came along and showed some evidence of profit making. In more recent turn, the economists have come around to say, although slavery seemed to have an economic rationale at its inception, it ends up turning around and creating impediments, institutional impediments to subsequent economic growth. The historians have come around in the new history of capitalism to say slavery promotes growth. So you've kind of had this shift. What we're doing is taking a different perspective, returning to the question of how did slavery operate during the period of its existence, and we're going to be looking at the comparison at the border. We are not, obviously, the first people to ever pose this. Famously, Alex de Tocqueville posed this in his Democracy in America. His traveling compartment was Gustav Beaumont. And even they weren't the first to pose this comparison at the border. The story would be that they come to America to study prisons. They learn a lot about North-South differences when they're traveling in the Northeast, but they have a trouble distinguishing between the impact of the geography, the climate, the heat, and the institution, namely coerced labor, namely slavery. They travel to Pittsburgh, get on a steamboat on the Ohio River, go down the Ohio River, and they notice that the environment basically looks the same. That was the pictures that Beaumont showed. But the institutions, the Northwest Ordinance, outlawed slavery on the northern side. And what they observe and hear testimony from local experts on both sides of the river is that the north side is characterized by industry and immigration, and the south side is characterized by sloth and stagnation. And so there's a picture of Kentucky starts being settled by Europeans earlier, but Ohio grows much faster despite being started later. So there's a picture that Ohio on the free side is much more dramatic, or much more rapid. And then de Tocqueville writes, and so these are copies of some notes of his travel diary, that you can't attribute this to any other cause than slavery. Slavery brutalizes the Black population, and it de-energizes the white population. And he says, man is not made for servitude. Now, what we're going to do in the paper is go beyond the Ohio River and look at the entire border region from Delaware all the way to Missouri. We are going to treat New Jersey as a slave state in the way that the documents from the 1850s, 1860s did, even though even at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, there are a small number of slaves, elderly slaves remaining in New Jersey. But we're going to treat this as the border. And then we're going to take a stance or start at this with sort of a local public finance perspective, which is mobile factors, so free labor, or in fact, slave labor of a sort, is going to be elastic and can be able to move. And the effect of a policy like abolition will be borne by the immobile factors, namely in this case, land. And so you're going to look at essentially what happens to land as sort of the start of this. Land is a sufficient statistic. How is it used? How is it valued? From the local public finance, you would think if you can do something in one area that you can't do in the other area, namely hold people in bondage, then you'd think in the area where you're allowed to do that, land should have higher value because you're allowed to do one more thing. So that's going to be kind of its prediction. Land rent should be higher, site rent should be higher on the slave side. Okay, so we run a whole series of specifications using county level data principally from the antebellum censuses. We look at myriad outcomes, population and so on. We're going to normalize by the size of the county or by farm acre. We're going to contrast the slave and free states as of 1860. We are going to mostly look around 1860, but sometimes go earlier. We don't do a lot of stuff later because we don't want to be too contaminated by what happens afterward. We're going to weight by county area. We're going to try to deal with issues with spatial econometrics and make sure that we're all passing the test that Kelly has put for us. They'll control. The specifications will include cubics for longitude as well as the running variable distance from the border, and then we'll have different samples. Exactly on the border, a donut 1 county away from the border, things in 150 miles, and then things in 300 miles. So we'll be doing that sort of thing. So here's a picture of the border. You'll see that it's not at the same latitude. It does go up, it does go down. And then you can see the 150-mile band and then the 300-mile band in this kind of picture. 300 miles is pretty extensive. One thing will be here, the 150 miles, this is not going to be cotton country. This will be tobacco, hemp, and other things principally. So it's going to be in this border. And I'll be arguing that this is one of the places where slavery is in contest, that it's the place where slavery is first introduced into the Anglo-American colonies, and it's going to be this important area in which basically the fate of slavery is going to be under contest, both being pushed up and being pushed out. Okay, so you can look at, this is kind of a first stage in the strategy of the non-white population, and you can see that there's much more non-white population on the southern side of the border. And then you can look at the rural population, and you'll observe, as many people observed in more localized studies, is the density is much higher on the northern side of the border. And so then you can translate it into these essentially regression coefficients. So on this side will be the coefficient for being on the slave side. On the other will be the coefficient for being, if you're on the free side. And you can see that there are many more non-whites. So 6 per 1,000 acres on the slave side. So you get this is really slavery is having an impact. The striking thing is the population density is there are going to be 40 fewer whites on the slave side. It's going to be pushed down. So you get this more non-whites and many fewer whites on the slave side. You can look at land, and what you'll see is land area per acre is about, or per county acre is about the same for farmland, but it's much less improved on the slave side, and the land values are much, much lower. So if you look at the fullest band, it's going to be like 55% lower land values per farm acre. And so that will be sort of directly in contradiction with the idea that you can do more things, the land will be more valuable. Here it's you can do more things, and something is pushing those land values very much farther down. This is not something that just starts in the 1860s. It will be essentially, you can see the differences in non-white density, in overall rural density, in land use. You can see that push back basically beginning. So it's since 1790. So this is not a new thing. This is not something that just erupted in the 1850s. Okay, so one thing you might say is, okay, well, maybe there's some other difference. So we look at soil mass, we look at climate. This is where we're basically asking, are they similar or different in terms of various characteristics? And you see in this, sort of looking at the soil variables, it's just all over the map. Okay, so the picture is there's not a definable difference between one area and another. You can see, across the river, it might be different. Things sort of balance out. It's not 100% they're all the same, but it's basically there is sort of a balance of different things in different areas. The southern side might have the topsoil might be slightly thinner, but it's like a difference between, is the topsoil 3 feet deep or is it 9 feet deep? Something like on that order of magnitude. I'm making that up, but there's a difference in topsoil, but it's sort of not just on the surface. It's very great depth sort of thing. Now, we do all sorts of sensitivity analysis. We make sure that the standard areas are proof to what Morgan Kelly says are problems. We do controls for environmental areas. We could do controls for the benzo longitude. We do subsamples with, are you in the public land survey? Do you have a problem with soil exhaustion? And you can see with the public land survey, it's not just Ohio is in the, so does that mean 5 minutes left or? Okay, okay. So you can see that a lot of the area that's under consideration is in the public land survey in the comparisons of Missouri and Iowa and so on. So that you're sort of balancing across that. You can do this question of, are we just looking at a jump at the border? And this is analysis Hoyt has recently created, where it shows that the land values are rising up to the border on the northern side. They're rising up to or near the border on the southern side. And then there's this jump down. And if you extrapolate it out, the gap would be even bigger than at just the border if you were, 100 miles further south. So it's these results are not just a border effect. They're essentially, in terms of land values and population density, they're characterizing pushing very much further south. Note that you can look at the medians of the population, acreage, and so on, and they're typically in the area that we're considering or near the boundary of the area that we're considering. So you might think the South is the southern frontier, the cotton frontier and pushing out, but a lot of the important activity is in the area that is being under investigation here right at the border. Now, we do a whole bunch of things. I need to speed through them. More tobacco, less dairy in the South, larger farm sizes in the South. And then you can go through all the structural characteristics, manufacturing, transportation, and so on. No, we're at the border. The border is often river, so the transportation differences aren't going to be great. Now, take a step further, and we can go to the Census of Social Statistics, and that has wages at the county level. Now, these are kind of noisy. So what we'll tend to do is use the first principal component, combine them across areas, and then you get this very striking result. So one of the things they have is board, and the cost of living is about the same, as you'd expect if you're in neighboring areas on a navigable waterway. But the wages are 10% higher in the south of the border. So it's essentially, if you put it in a Rosen-Rohrbach model, you've got lower land values and higher wages in the South. And what does that tell you? That tells you that people who are free to choose have to be paid more and get lower land values in order to live there. The free people do not want to be in that area. They have aversion to it. And so you can just basically say it could be productivity amenities. There's some disamenity to being in the slave area for free people. And if you look at the migration flows, so we didn't really put this in the paper, there are big flows of free whites out of the border South. So basically 30% of heads of households, you can really see this if you look at heads of households who are born in the upper South, live in the free areas. And that's way more than live in the deep South on the cotton frontier. So they are essentially voting with their feet, choosing to leave. Now, we can look at various determinants of land differences. We can look at TFP. That's kind of a crude way to do it with Fogel and Ingram. These are not big TFP differences in the way that we measure it. If you get a 10% higher wage, that will lead to, depending on the factor shares, a 20 to 30% lower land value. So that can account for part of the gap. You can look at the population density, the improvements, that will account for another part of the gap. So you can chip away at the gap. It turns out that pecuniary taxes aren't big, nor are interest rates. So we do various ways where we're attempting to control for, is the land improved? You get into this comparison that Kentucky's Cassius Clay made. So he's a slave owner and an abolitionist. And he'll end up saying, if they abolish slavery in Kentucky, it will have a sufficiently large effect on my land values that it will more than pay for the cost of emancipating slaves. Okay, my slaves. So you get this kind of thing where people who are there are saying this very thing. It's having this adverse effect on land values. Now you can get into questions about why is this? What are the institutions that slavery is imposing, not just on African Americans, as cruel as it is, but also on free whites that make those who are not owning slaves not want to be there. And so it will be essentially, how do the slave owners capture the system in order to keep it under slavery? Okay, and you can think of militia, you can think of failure, slave patrols, threat of slavery as a violent system. It ends violently. There's always a threat of violence. And then you can think of things like not getting the kind of education, the kind of opportunities that you want. Okay, 0 minutes. So the summary is, we look at this, we welcome essentially requests for the paper. Please send them to us, and thank you.
Austin, is that working?
Yep, it's working.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mindy, especially, and everyone else. It's a pleasure to comment on this paper because I think it's an exceptional paper, a game-changing paper. When we talk about the effects of slavery, we economic historians, we may say many things, but we always have to hedge our comments by saying, of course, the effects of slavery interacted with those of geography and perhaps characteristics of crops, that sort of thing. So I'm not necessarily talking about just the effects of slavery. Here we have a paper that really does the kind of rigorous test that economists look for, in that we are looking at a slavery effect. Let's hope this, hitting this down button doesn't work. Try getting that.
So if you do view on the, slideshow on the top, and then you can do presenter view.
And I think if you click there.
Okay, I'll try that. Here's a quick summary, but Paul gave you most of this, so I will try to be quick. They show that population density was lower on the slave side of the border. That's broadly speaking what we already knew. But notice that their test is slave versus free, a 0-1 variable. And as far as I can see, every test in the paper has that character. They are not using the share of slaves in the population of the labor force, which is often used for measures people trying to get at the legacy of slavery or something of that kind. I think they should do that, although I think comparing it to other kind of null hypotheses would be a good idea. They also show that farm value per acre was lower on the slave side. They go on to argue, this is an extension, that's the one I have most trouble with, that the adverse effects of slavery are greater, even greater, the farther you go from the border. They show, as Paul just told you, that wages of free labor were higher on the slave side. And then we have this interesting calculation by Cassius Clay. And if you don't know who Cassius Clay was, I'd be delighted to tell you, but I would need an extra 10 minutes, so I won't. That abolition would essentially have paid for itself in the form of higher land values. Now, here's a photo of Tocqueville steaming the Ohio River. I myself have done this trip in a steamboat. Case and I did it, 1999. I can tell you the observation is still accurate, at least it was in 99. You have forest area, not much happening on the Kentucky side. You have lots of activity, or at least signs of former industrial activity on the Ohio side. Now, the fact that it still seems accurate all those years later might lead you to wonder, well, do we really understand it? Nonetheless, I don't think that Tocqueville was just seeing things that he had just been primed to see. Here's a quote. I won't read it all, but it's beautiful language. The traveler who floats down the current of the Ohio may be said to sail between liberty and servitude, and a transient inspection of the surrounding objects will convince him which of the two is most favorable to mankind. Upon the left bank of the stream, the population is rare, so he was talking about density. On the right, you have a confused hum proclaiming the presence of industry. The fields are covered with abundant harvest. The elegance of the dwellings announces the taste and activity of the laborer. Now, these are the areas in which I will make comments, but most of my comments are on what interesting things to follow up and do more with, because I think this paper is going to have a long life. It's consistent with what has been broadly known before about north-south patterns, but now we have a confirmation of a slavery effect. I do think the main opposite number there is actually on our panel today, John Majewski. There's a citation to the environmental origins of shifting cultivation, which attributes the difference in population density mainly to soil quality. I do think more attention to the geography of slavery within the region, within the slave region, would be beneficial. But also more attention to the collective action character of land value augmentation in free and slave states. And then finally to the last area of slavery and crops. I may not get to all these, but I'll do what I can. Now, John's analysis was based on soil quality maps such as this. This comes from Douglas Helms' presidential address to the Agricultural History Society. And the key point is that you have these low quality alpha soils in the south and higher quality alpha soils and vertisols to the north. So the argument was that you needed more land and a shift in cultivation pattern in order to meet the food supply. Now, I don't think this paper shows that John was altogether wrong about this. And I do think that that interaction of those two factors, you do find that soils matter. And the interaction of those two factors would be well worth exploring. But it does show that there was a slavery effect. See, John and I have had a running conversation about this over many decades. So I've always said there's a slavery effect. But he will speak up for himself, I'm sure, perhaps not today. When I say it's broadly consistent with what we already know, well, here's a map showing farm value per acre, 1860. You get the same kind of thing with population density. But do you have a boundary effect when you look at it this way? You might think so, but you might not be sure because there's a lot of heterogeneity there. What is most striking to me is that we are seeing the, I'll call it, adverse effects of slavery on land values, even in counties in the slave area, which had very few or next to no slaves. And that is a highly interesting proposition. To me, it makes sense, but of course, it points us toward what's at work. What is the model here? When I say more attention to the geography of slavery within the slave area, what I have in mind is this. Here's a map of the value of farmland in 1860. And what I'm going to show you is these high value areas were highly correlated with the presence of slave labor. Now, you wouldn't want to do this kind of thing or demonstration across the border between slave and free areas, because as we've seen in free areas, the soil value was being augmented over time. But nonetheless, there's the value, and here's the distribution of slave population. I tried to do a little bit along the same direction as this paper by talking about these three areas to the north, not cotton areas, that's the Little Dixie area of Missouri. Here's the bluegrass area of Kentucky. Here's the wheat areas of Virginia. All of them, slavery was thriving in the antebellum period, despite the presence of a robust slave market there to the south. Okay, same quote, continuing from Tocqueville. The activity of Ohio is not confined to individuals, but the undertakings of the state are surprisingly great. You can't quite say, well, he saw this with the naked eye, but he remarked, a canal has been established between Lake Erie and the Ohio. The point is there was much greater investment in transportation in the free states. The canal boom was almost entirely a free state thing. I understand that part of the idea of the Ohio River boundary is you're standardizing transportation costs, so that's an issue. But the Ohio canals would take that commerce up to the north. Next comment is about crops. Maybe these coefficients don't surprise you here. Client slave areas were more conducive to tobacco. corn was indifferent, but wheat is up there. You can see it. That's more conducive to free labor or vice versa. However, they are surprising to me because I've worked with Jim Irwin's data from the Virginia Piedmont, and it shows just the opposite. In the slave area, you find that wheat was much more highly correlated with slave growing. The wheat share is dark line here, and the tobacco share is the crosshatch. Tobacco was a better small farmer crop than was now maybe than it was a slave crop in these particular areas. Obviously, these areas might have been exceptional in some sense, but if so, it's an exception that deserves attention in this kind of discussion. I'm going to skip over this because I truly don't understand this diagram. Maybe it needs to be developed. You don't want to hear about it from somebody who doesn't understand it. Just make the point. These two curves don't seem to fit those lines, which I would draw a line to the other direction. That doesn't seem consistent to what I see with the naked eye about the gradient or trajectory of land values as you go north from the border. The wage rate question is really, really interesting. To me, these results are seem powerful. They seem robust. Maybe it's the amenities of a slave's society, but I think of this as a border effect and not necessarily something that could be extended safely to the entire South. See, if you look at farm wages, there's a fair range here. As Bob Margo has documented, there was a downward drift within the South relative to the national average. Here's Kentucky right in the middle, and then continue down afterwards. If you try to interpret these fluctuations and trends, I don't think you'd be led to interpret them in terms of variations in the attitudes about slavery or disamenities of slavery. You might, but those would tend to be something that would be more fixed over time. As to the last calculation, which is very interesting, but I have trouble seeing it, Cassius Clay seemed to say even I, a big slave owner, would come out ahead this way. If you look at the total value of slaves in Kentucky, 180 million, the gain from 55% in the increase of farmland would be about 128 million. I don't really see where the surplus would be. I do see that the non-slave owners would gain. The paper says we estimate that at least 50% of households on the slave side, plus 41% in Kentucky, would not have lost wealth. Is that 41% of the slave owners? Because the non-slave owners would not have lost wealth. So I don't quite understand what's being said there. But in the end, I think they're saying something sensible, which is that it's really only the larger slave owners who would have lost from this transition. And that, I think, calls attention to what really the paper is showing us. We're seeing a relatively small minority of slave owners who are profiting from the system, and it's really at the expense of everyone else.
So we have a little bit of time for questions. We got a bit of a late start because of technology, so maybe take 3 minutes of questions. We have questions both from
Why don't you recognize us?
Zoom and from the room. So if you have a question in Zoom, you can go ahead and chat. Let's take the first question from the room. For questions from the room, if we want the Zoom people to hear, we have to come up to this microphone because that one I think is not working. Do you want to, Chris, do you want to come up and ask a question?
The tables were about farm value, but you kept using the words land value. And then you briefly alluded to ways that you tried to control for the difference in levels of improvement between the southern farms and the northern farms. Could you talk a little bit more about what you did there?
Okay. Do a quick answer. So we tried to
If you go to the microphone, so
Okay. So we tried to take out the value of buildings. We used Primax numbers of the share building value by state. So this wasn't done at the county level. We didn't have the fine detail to do that. And then we tried to do various things using numbers that Gallman came up with, and also Gallman and Primac for the value of improved land relative to unimproved land. And when you do that, you still do get the site rent differences. And so they're diminished, but they're still present even after you account for that. So that said, the fact that less of the land is improved and the fact that there are fewer people and less activity using buildings is still an impact of the systems. And so it's a way it's being manifest rather than simply something that you can just totally net out. But Hoyt should deal with some.
You want to take one question from Zoom too, or can I respond to Gavin?
Okay. Zoom right now in the chat.
You don't see. Okay. All right. Great. Well, Gavin, thank you very much for those thoughtful comments. And I would say they have sort of a fractal character to them in the sense that we could talk about them and then we could look at each one. There'd be more detail, and we'd look a little more, there'd be more detail. And so I can't hope to respond to that. The issue of the share of a population that's enslaved versus not is obviously not what we look at principally at the border. And that's just concomitant with research design. We've struggled with this a lot because you could imagine thinking about, people, it's very popular with these suitability indices as well. I think I might have to get a different co-author if I were to start using the suitability indices because he doesn't like them. And I think he's right in not liking them. But that you sort of need to tell me, all right, this region is not only on the slave side, but you tell me that the other side, the Ohio side, would have a lot of slavery. We need some measure like that to do the interaction. I will say there's this nice work by Clegg. Is it Jonathan Clegg at Chicago, a sociologist, who does sort of the exercise that I think you want, which is he looks at wages as it relates to the fraction enslaved in the free wages, obviously, and he finds this positive relationship as well. So it's present on this intensive margin, but it's not subject to using this kind of research design. But I agree heterogeneity is important. I agree these interactions are important. I agree we don't do them. And it's something that it's a struggle that we continue to think about. In terms of this aggregate calculation, I don't think what we did was wrong because we were inflating our estimates or for the farm value, not the land value. Chris Haynes is correct. We need to be careful about when we say which. And so the 55% would apply to the top number, which would get us sort of in the ballpark. It's close. And your other calculation, most large slave owners are also large landowners. And so there are, in fact, many large slave owners who have enough land that they're would be compensated in this Cassius Clay kind of counterfactual. How much time do I have? Probably 0 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, that's fine. I am completely on board, by the way, with Gavin's comment about collective action being done differently. It's interesting because, again, there's sort of this economists might come to say when you have a bunch of large landowners, you should be able to solve collective action problems more easily. So you would maybe get more drainage, you'd maybe get more canal building, get more, other kinds of internal improvements where there are these small number of actors that can coordinate. Interestingly, you get the opposite. And why do you get that? Well, that comes back to this kind of institutional pollution aspect. We'll think of it that way, that slaveholding has, which is that the slave owners don't want to have a lot of these other aspects of the modernizing economy because it competes with what they do. There are other things that are like, even at a small scale, for example, if you were a peddler, it was hard to go sell stuff in these areas because they were worried about people bringing ideas. You may also be familiar with the ban on what could be sent in the mail. There's a whole series of other things where the society ends up kind of being clamped down because the planters that have political control don't think institutional change, don't think economic change would be good for them, principally because they're worried about expropriation. All right, and I don't need to recap the whole history of, from the up to 1860 to sort of discuss that, but that should be in your mind. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, well, we're setting up here.
I reduced this presentation to 28 slides. So I know I'm not going to all of them. And I sort of feel as though I have to explain myself. Can I take this? I can take this off. I have to sort of explain myself. And you probably want to know what this title means, National Laws and Race Laws. It's a paper I co-authored with Nina Banks, and it's basically a literature review. So you're not going to have an introduction, review of the literature, specification test, etc.
Are the slides working, Warren? Or could you test the slides? I'm on Zoom over here. Could you test that the slides are moving?
The slides are moving here, but not.
Okay, yeah, they're not moving for us, so maybe, I'm not sure, so maybe quit out and then
It
share
says
again.
it's sharing.
Make sure it's sharing to the correct window. Okay, we're seeing the move now.
We can just do it like this. Will it work?
That will work for us if that works for you.
Is that good if we just do it that way? Austin?
Yeah, that works for us on Zoom.
Is that okay if it looks like that for all of us?
Oh, this.
If you could, that would be awesome.
That's actually my job. Tries that speed up.
Oh, perfect. We have the problem that I have a Mac and where this is a PC.
You have to go to slideshow on the top.
We're thinking differently. The computer's just thinking differently also. So I feel like I haven't gotten a lot of sleep, so my problem solving abilities are minimum here.
Is it working now?
I think so. Could you test the slides, see if we can see them moving? Yep, we're seeing them. Okay, sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, where are we here? Okay, this paper, it's really a literature review. And it's a paper, literally a product of these bizarre times we live in. And I want to explain what I mean by that. It began with a paper request for special issue of the Journal of Economic Literature on race and stratification economics. Our profession sort of opening up to new ideas about these topics. And I was asked to co-author this paper with Nina Banks, who had just written a book on Sadie Alexander, first Black PhD in economics in the United States. And the request said, use Sadie Alexander to demonstrate the costs of racial exclusion in the economics profession, and how racial exclusion has influenced knowledge about the economy. To which I said, what? Mm-hmm. And then why me? You know, and while you're at it, do encyclopedic literature review. This is the Journal of Economic Literature, right? So we're absolutely stumped on this. No template, no data section, no hypothesis test, no sensitivity test, nothing. And we're doing this over Zoom, right? Because it's in the middle of the pandemic. So we almost gave up until January 6th of this year. Sitting in our living room, looking at this assault on the Capitol building, and everyone on TV saying, this is a nation of laws. We're a nation of laws. This shouldn't happen. Peaceful transition of power. I said, yeah, that's right. But my second thought was, wow, if these folks were Black, It wouldn't look like this. So I get on Zoom and I talk to Nina Banks. We're trying to work this thing through. And Nina says to me, wow, what if they were Black? It wouldn't look like that. Sadie Alexander has something to say about that. She has something to say about the relationship between racial discrimination and racism and democracy and lawlessness, things of that nature. So we figured we had our hook. That's the title, Nation of Laws and Race Laws. Now, who is this Sadie Alexander? Sadie Tanner Alexander, first PhD, Black PhD in economics in the country. At the age of 23 from the University of Pennsylvania. She couldn't get a job, so she became a lawyer, went back to school, got a law degree, brilliant person. Became an activist lawyer, was a Republican most of her life. But by 1947, President Truman is appointing her to serve on the Civil Rights Commission that issued the report to secure these rights, which informs the Democratic platform that year. Strom Thurmond and Dixiecrats bolt from that convention, and the political realignment of the post-war period is well underway. So here's what she says about racism and rule of law. And there are many quotes like this in her speeches and in her writings. Until the American people realize how substantially their peace and security, as well as the moral fiber of the race, are being destroyed by the almost general disregard of law, we shall continue to face lawlessness and all the accompanying dangers of to our homes and to our national security that follow in the wake of the disrespect of law. And just to be clear, that this works on both sides, disabuse your minds from the thought that only Negroes are affected by such discriminations. The continuous disregard for law destroys the moral fiber of a community because it establishes a basis for the general disregard of law, which is exactly what we thought we saw, I'm convinced we saw on January 6th. Now, it's just not laws on the books, and just not discriminatory laws on the books, but she goes further to say the Bill of Rights constitutes restrictions on the power of government. They fail, however, to anticipate that rights can be withheld as effectively by barriers established by a majority of the people. These customs and norms having the strength of laws as effectively as if the laws had been passed by Congress and other legislative bodies. So we follow her lead, because it's one of our directives. And we take rule of law to mean the written and established laws. We take race laws to mean laws that apply to race. And in this particular article, to African Americans. There are explicit laws on the books. They can be implicit laws based on customs and norms. And they could be laws that appear to be race neutral, but have a disparate effect by race. Now we, of course, have to get out of, we felt we had to get out of the straitjacket of discrimination, as economists think of it, and we went for racism, a larger picture of what's going on here. And so we adopted this notion of racism that's been with me ever since I was in college, and still seems to inform the situation. Racism is the generalized and final assignment of values to real or imagined differences to the accuser's benefit and to the victim's expense in order to justify the former's own privilege and aggression. Sounds powerful, but it's systematic. It's not people, but it's system. And it's the last part of that that really hooked us. First moment, markets assigning values, that's the way economists tend to think about this, wage differentials, et cetera. Second moment's political economy. Somebody has to have the power to enforce this, okay, to the benefit of those doing, or the system doing this. The third moment we take to be race laws. What's justifying this in the sense that systemic racism is the word that people throw around. My co-author doesn't like that because her view is that racism itself is systemic. So just say racism. That racism needs to be justified, legitimized by something. Otherwise, it's just individuals and in a competitive environment that tends to disappear. So the paper's goal is to describe how race laws, written and unwritten, justify reproduction of systemic racism. We look for evidence of historical persistence in these systems and their outcomes. We offer some historical examples of how race laws threaten rule of law. Offer some examples of the cost of racial exclusion in the economics profession for our understanding of the economics of racism, not the economy in general. We back away from that. And then we do that encyclopedic literature review. So these are the racisms we discuss. Racial slavery as a system, where we argue that race law is rule of law. There's very little space between the two. Jim Crow lynching as a system where local race laws overrule federal rule of law. Negro jobs, which is where the market sort of masked race laws behind colorblind rule of law. And the making of the ghetto, as far as I can tell, all of the above. Okay. So where am I now? What are I? 5 minutes. Okay, so racial slavery is easy. I'm not going to spend much time on that. Slavery bestows upon some the right to the life product and the offspring of others. And then legislative rulings sort of classify Africans increasingly as a race, Negroes, and in a variety of ways. And their explicit laws justify the system by stamping African Americans as racially inferior. Thomas Jefferson, therefore, can own slaves and write the Declaration of Independence. John Locke, therefore, can invest in the Royal African Company and write the second treatise on government. Okay, thus racial slavery and American racism are born. Now, persistence, if there is no persistence, then I think a lot of us are wasting a lot of time and mental energy trying to figure this stuff out. Impact on the economics profession. Slaves weren't in the economy. They had notions about what markets were doing in their lives. They were being bought, sold. There's some evidence that family structure amongst slaves evolved to reduce the probability of being sold, building networks across individuals, kinship networks, even across plantations. So yet the economics of slavery that we have talks about profitability, viability, and efficiency of slavery, all from the slave owner's point of view. So had these slaves been economists, we'd have a very different notion of understanding of American slavery. Lynching. Local race laws overrule federal rules of law. Okay, after Reconstruction, federal rule of law, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment provides protections, law-abiding African Americans, but race law operated at the local level. Local intimidation of effective Black elected officials, Trevon Logan, I think, shows that case very well. The locally sanctioned lynching, to enforce the norm, know your place. And maybe that's one of that definitely was there under slavery, but lynching wasn't required because you had night riders and local enforcement police and things of that nature. So there's a host of literature on this lynching, enforcing this norm, know your place, going all the way back to Ida B. Wells. coming up to the 21st century. Now there's a time series and a seasonality component here. Here's a time series of lynching superimposed on a time series of cotton prices. You'll see in the early part, this is during the implementation of Jim Crow. So it's not like a lynching is a response to the establishment of racial segregation, and then local lynching takes off. It's actually like lynching is instrumental in the implementation of Jim Crow legislation, that intimidation factor. C. Van Woodward argued this many, many years ago. The inverse correlation with cotton prices, some have used to argue that, well, the lynching is white Southerners trying to drive away the competition during times of economic distress. I'm not so convinced of that. I mean, I think the time series time series property, I can't. Okay. Now the seasonality shows that the lynching peaks during mid-season after sharecroppers have invested in the crop, which mitigates out-migration because the landlords want to keep the labor there. And the landlords are controlling the local police power. So you wait till mid-season and you let whatever is happening in the broader general environment happen, the elites let the lynching occur because it can proceed without driving away too many workers. The decline over time in the lynching, I think, is best explained by the out-migration of Southern African Americans. Persistence, there's a lot of evidence on persistence. We're seeing that areas that experience these lynchings, you find lower African-American voter registration rates today. You find higher murder rates today. You find less support for hate crime legislation, things of that nature. I'm done? Yeah. Okay. And then there's Jim Crow jobs in the North and South. These are my 28 slides here. And this is some work I did with Chris Ford and Gavin Wright on the Ford Motor Company, where we can actually see these Negro jobs emerging in the North. The norm here, real quickly, the norm here is that Blacks are not supposed to supervise whites, okay? And when Dewey observed that, I said, yeah, man, I always wondered that, as a child even, why in every situation was a white person supervising? I don't care if it was in a bank, in a restaurant, picking up trash on the street. It was always this racial hierarchy. So that was informed in the workplace, enforced at the firm gate. In the North, they're more flexible, but using Ford, we're able to see how that happens. There's higher unemployment in the North, greater commitment to wage equality in the North. Ford called out one wage for jobs and then looked at the response of workers to that wage and how long those workers stayed on the job. Observed that Black workers stayed in the disagreeable jobs longer than whites. Boom, concentrated in the foundry. High-wage foundry jobs eventually become low-wage Black department. And that's a general phenomenon, widespread. There are lots of studies confirming that, and lots of studies confirming that this pattern persists, even after the civil rights legislation. Cost of exclusion, this research is not being done at NBER. It's not part of that economic history group at NBER, but it was often highlighted, centrally highlighted by early Black social scientists, and in fact highlighted as a process that reproduced racism. Okay? And the ghetto, making it a ghetto, at least I got through some of it. Now, returning to January 6th, Ted Cruz Senator Ted Cruz, I'm sorry, invokes the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877 as precedent for what they were trying to do. But that essentially put an end to Reconstruction and the removal of the federal troops from the South. So from this perspective, January 6th and the siege on the Capitol was an attempt to undermine the rule of law, to preserve race law. Now, Sadie Alexander, we think, would have been concerned, as we all are, but she would not have been surprised, as I think many of us were.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The discussion by Jonathan Pritchett, who's on Zoom.
And I have no slides.
Okay.
Okay, I'll keep it short. So this is a paper that concerns the work and the writings of Sadie Alexander, who was the first African-American PhD in economics. I did not know that. Pretty cool. And she not only had a PhD in economics, but also she was a lawyer because she couldn't get a job in academics because of her race. Now, she works primarily in the fields of law and race, and she's been interested in these, I guess we'll call Warren's calling them race laws, but there's a variety of the ones that he discussed. So, for example, you can talk about redlining, or you can talk about the black codes or disenfranchisement. Perhaps more controversial were her writings on the effects of these laws on, I guess, the white population. So she writes, for example, that a race law destroys the moral fiber of a community because it establishes a basis for the general disregard of law. And indeed, much of this paper is, well, there's literature review, but also it is a discussion of these laws and also the behavior of whites and white politicians. Okay. So my first comment, criticism, I guess we could say, is that I'm easily confused, and I'm sitting there reading this paper, and there's a use of race laws and rule of law that I oftentimes had a hard time keeping straight. So, for example, a race law could be either lawful or unlawful depending upon who passed the law. This is just indeed kind of hard to keep straight. And indeed, when we start talking about the behavior of lawless whites, for example, it really does depend upon what time period you're talking about. What are the circumstances? So, for example, if we're talking about the antebellum period, where Southern whites are passing laws that are controlling the Black population, then whites are perfectly lawful under those circumstances. They're not lawless, okay? At least they're in the sense that they're following law. And then, of course, afterwards, okay, they are acting lawless. So, it's kind of, I don't know. I find that a bit confusing. I wonder if there's a way that you could sort of keep that straight, at least in my mind. So I'm going to illustrate this with a point. Okay, so during the antebellum period, slaveholders passed laws mandating these slave patrols in order to be able to prevent slaves from, say, leaving their plantations and migrating and whatever. Well, In order to ban these, they required eligible whites to participate. Well, not all of them wanted to, right? I mean, so they basically, you know, at least some of them, okay, had to be coerced into participating in these. I mean, right? They're free riders to some extent, and that you're generating, I'll use my air quotes here, a public good, at least for the white population, in the sense of trying to intimidate the black population. Okay. After the war, then there's a substitute private organization which developed, the Ku Klux Klan, right? That is in some sense, you know, trying to do some of the very same things. But now the important difference is that you can no longer coerce the white population into doing these things, so, or part of the white population. So then the question is, how do you solve this free rider problem? You no longer can use laws in order to be able to solve this. So I'm going to go ahead and mention Mansur-Olson. You're all probably familiar with the logic of collective action, but again, the idea was, how do you motivate people working in groups in order to be able to accomplish these group goals? The problem that you run into is that the benefits are diffuse, right? The costs are concentrated. Rational behavior suggests that you shouldn't participate. So if you remember, Olson's solution to this problem was that we increase the private benefits to the participants. Okay, let's use an application here. So you can think of lynching as an example of collective behavior, right? Okay, so, and again, I guess I'll give a shout out here to Lisa Cook, who was also a participant in this panel. Again, the problem that at least whites might face under these circumstances is that, you know, if the expected benefits are less than the cost, why should you participate in such behavior? And of course, we're not talking about the moral aspects. So as you might see, I guess my one slide is my background here. This is a photograph of the lynching of Henry Smith in 1893. Now, the thing that I want to point out to you in the background here is, maybe get out of the way as much as I can, is that there are a lot of people here, a shocking number of people. It's been estimated as many as 10,000 people witnessed this murder of Mr. Smith. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, why are these people participating in this lynching? Right? I mean, we had this suggestion previously that lynchings might have been done for economic motives, right? So one thought is, okay, we'll intimidate black workers in order to drive up the wages of the remaining whites. But, you know, that doesn't really fit here, okay? Because if you think about it again, the benefits associated with this are diffuse, right? You're going to be slightly increasing the wage, okay? But the costs are concentrated. But you've got all these people participating. Well, let's go back to Olson. Olson suggests that there must have been some private benefits associated with attending this lynching, which is really bizarre if you think about it, right? It's like these guys are racist or sadists, okay? But there is, in some sense, a private benefit associated from going to this lynching. Where is it coming from? Okay. Now, it's not the case that it's that all these people are racist, or because the people who are being involved, okay, right, the person who's being lynched in this particular case, is a person who in some sense violated a social norm, right? It's not that all blacks are being lynched, but it's just those who in some sense, to use Warren's expression, don't know their place, right? They don't know their place, and they're the ones that end up being the target of this mob behavior, okay? So we end up with this situation where private individuals are participating in group actions and they're somehow solving the problems that were associated with Mansur Olson's in terms of his this group actions. Okay, so really that's all I had. I thought it was an intriguing paper. I enjoyed reading it, and part of the reason why I liked reading it so much is because it got me thinking about this issue. Okay, that's all I have. Thanks very much.
So I might propose, if everyone, our speakers are amenable to this, going on to the next paper and then doing questions at the end. Does that sound good for everybody? Okay. And I'll take responsibility for not being good at solving technology problems for going behind.
Okay, great. So I think this should work. We'll see. Okay, well, it's really fantastic to be here. And the topic of my paper for the panel, as you can see, is economic creativity in the slave economy, looking at different measures of economic creativity in slave cities before the Civil War. And the image that you see is from Frederick Douglass's 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. And this is Douglass's representation of freedom. This is like the second half of the book when he's talking about his freedom. This is how he illustrates it. And you can see at the very top, you have all the kind of classic 19th century indicators of economic progress, like the locomotive, the telegraph lines, canal, going under the bridge. Then in the middle section, you have all the indicators of prosperous northern agriculture. And then on the last, at the bottom, you see his representation of integrated school and seeing education as being absolutely essential, and how it works visually, that education is essential to northern economic progress, foundational in a way. And this is going to be one of the themes of my paper, that in terms of economic creativity, the differences in education and cultures of literacy between North and South are absolutely critical. So to begin with, I want to define exactly what I mean by economic creativity. And wanted to say, first of all, that of course, all cultures, all societies are creative. Every culture, every society has music, has art, has different forms of storytelling. But in capitalist economy, entrepreneurs and inventors and others turn insights, imagination, and ideas into commodities to sell, rent, license, or otherwise use in the pursuit of profit. And so for me, the classic example of the commodification of creativity, if you will, is a patent, where you have an idea, you have an experiment, you have imagine a new way of doing things, and then you apply for your patent, and suddenly you've turned that that kind of creative thought into a commodity that you can then buy, sell, rent, or use as you see fit. I also want to make clear that when I say economic creativity, that it's an interdisciplinary concept. Some people associate creativity with just with art, as in like creative writing. And I'm talking about all different sorts of creativity, whether it's organizational, engineering, and scientific creativity, along with fashion, art, and design. And so obviously the key question for this paper is, well, then how does slavery impact levels of economic creativity? And to answer that question, I look at cities before the Civil War. There's obviously a very large literature going back to Jane Jacobs that sees cities as key sites for generating economic creativity. In the 1850s, especially in the South, you have a number of important slave cities, and I would include Baltimore, New Orleans, St. Louis, and Louisville as being particularly important, and those four cities are in the top 12 largest cities in the United States in 1860. And this is the logic of the paper. It's in some ways related to Paul's and Hoyt's paper, and that some of these slave cities are very close to northern cities, which makes for particularly, I think, rich and robust comparisons. Yes.
Your slides aren't showing to the Zoom audience. They're not changing yet.
Yeah, that's way beyond. I thought I had it, but
I think we're having the same problem as earlier, where it's sharing to the wrong This is the wrong presenter area. Okay, we're seeing those change.
I find sometimes Zoom it'll share whatever program you're using, and so if you start sharing before you actually open the PowerPoint, it'll just keep showing the PowerPoint rather than the presentation. So should be working.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's look at the first measure of comparing economic creativity, and that is looking at particularly creative industries in the 1850s. And by particularly creative industries, I'm particularly interested in those industries which have engineering and organizational creativity combined with a big element of art, fashion, and design. And so these are industries which are undergoing high degrees of industrialization, of mechanization to a large extent, but are also involve a huge degree of art, of fashion, of design in terms of their success. And this is a picture of Horace Greeley, and Horace Greeley defined progress in the 19th century and the fact that industrialization was able to bring art to the masses in a way, and that was a commonplace observation in the 1840s and 1850s. So to give you an example of, let's see here, of what I'm talking about is the publishing industry. There's a huge outgrowth of output in the publishing industry in the 1840s and 1850s related to technological change. And that also leads to a huge increase in output of artistic creativity as well, whether it be literature or images, because images are easier to produce and publish than ever before. Another example would be musical instruments, particularly the piano. Some of the biggest factories in the United States in the 1850s are actually piano factories. The Chickering Piano Factory in Boston is reported to be the second largest building in the United States after the US Capitol. The very high technology enterprises using, for example, the very latest steam technology in order to work really sophisticated saws to get exactly the right veneers. But of course, making a piano also means that there's considerable artistic creativity as well by many of the workers. And if you look at these kinds of industries, let's skip ahead here, in terms of per capita value added in 1860, most of them are located in metro areas, and most of these are metro areas. It's the free labor metros that do the best. And I define a metropolitan area as a city greater than 100,000. And you can see that kind of the breakdown. One of the interesting things, if you look at all manufacturing at the very end there, you see that the free labor cities are well ahead of the slave cities. But if you look at the particularly creative industries, that the lead of the free labor cities is many, many, many times greater. And I think what's especially important is the publishing industry, where free labor cities are way ahead of their slave labor counterparts. So in publishing in the Midwest, those metros would be 5 to 6 times ahead of the slave metros, and in the Northeast, it would be 10 to 11 times the size of the publishing industry. And so those highly creative industries, there is a big regional differences. And I think publishing is important because, as we will see, it's related to literacy and schooling as well. Now, another measure that I use is patenting, which, like I said, I think is an excellent example of a creative commodity. And if you look at patents per million in urban counties, in urban county I defined as over 12,000 in population, you can see that there is a huge difference This is for patenting rates between 1856 and 1860. There's a huge boom in patenting at the end of the 1850s. And so these 65 urban counties account for approximately 10,000 patents, or about a quarter of all patents before the Civil War. And you can see that there's a huge regional difference, that the Northeast is particularly ahead of slave cities, but even the Midwest tends to be ahead. You'll also see that I look at both the patenting rates in slave cities in terms of total population and free population. It shows that looking at slave population, at total population, including the enslaved, indicates, I think, the true economic cost of slavery when it came to patenting, but there was also a significant cost if you just look at the free population. In fact, the only time that it's close is that if you look at the smaller slave cities and compare those with the small cities in the Midwest, but there you're comparing well-established cities like Richmond, Virginia, with relatively new cities in places like Iowa. And so it's not surprising that slave cities are close there. But if you look overall, there's a huge difference. And this is very broadly consistent with kind of another part of the paper about exhibitions at the New York Crystal Palace exhibit in 1853, where again, you find like the Midwest metros well ahead of slave cities in terms of the number of exhibits. If you just look at the cities that are close to each other, and again, this is where the logic of the paper resembles what Paul and Hoyt have done. Every time that there is a slave city close to a free labor city, the free labor city has a much higher patenting rate. And so Baltimore and Philadelphia are both very big cities, both rank in the top 5, and but Philadelphia is way ahead. Wilmington, Delaware, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania are similar in size, about 75 miles apart, but you can see that Lancaster is well ahead. You can see that in the Midwest, that Cincinnati and Indianapolis are way ahead of Louisville, even though Louisville is relatively close to Indianapolis and Cincinnati. And in fact, Louisville is a significant manufacturing city as well. And so this makes this difference particularly interesting. And the same thing with Chicago and St. Louis. There are relatively few slaves in St. Louis, but yet nevertheless, patenting in St. Louis is well behind Chicago. Chicago has experienced tremendous growth in the 1850s, has a smaller manufacturing sector than St. Louis, but nevertheless is at least somewhat ahead in patenting. And if you do the regression analysis, it kind of comes out as you would expect and shows pretty clearly that slavery is making a big difference in terms of patenting rates in these 65 cities. So obviously, per capita manufacturing is significantly positively associated with patenting, as is city size. Newer cities are obviously going to have fewer patents than more established cities because they have less well-developed infrastructure. But then once you hold all those factors, it's pretty clear that slavery is making a pretty big difference. And the question then becomes, well, why exactly is that the case? And the key explanation I focus on the paper is the big regional differences in terms of schooling and literacy. And so schooling rates in the South are well behind that of the North, and the literacy rates are much higher in the free population of the North than the free population of the South. The key thing here is that even in the border states, states like Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, the literacy rates are still really high. They're closer to the kind of the cotton states than the free labor states. So this could help explain what's happening in cities such as like Baltimore and St. Louis. And then just the general point that education and literacy were marks of class and racial privileges in the slave states, that they were not in the same way in northern states. And one of the ways of that just has occurred to me in the last month or so is to kind of demonstrate the importance of education is looking where inventors were born. And so I have a very preliminary sample of 230 inventors in 1859 and 1860 that I linked to the 1860 census. I found that only 30% of inventors in the slave cities were born in the South. Now, maybe you could say, well, frustrated inventors, creative types in the South then moved to the Midwest or other parts of the country, but only 12% of inventors in Midwestern states were born in slave states, and that's mostly in Indiana. And then so far, a very preliminary sample of New York City, which had close ties to many of these slave cities, reveals that no inventors were born. So if you adjust this admittedly small sample that needs to be filled out by the correct regional weights, it implies that less than 6% of inventors were born in the South, but in the terms of free population, people born in the South made up 29% of overall population. And so there's a big difference here. And so kind of the logic, the implication is that people who are educated, acculturated in the South are less inclined to invent no matter where they're located. And then to kind of like demonstrate this more directly with the regression analysis, it does indicate two indicators here that are particularly important. So the state illiteracy rate in 1860 is strongly negatively associated with patenting rates. And then another measure, which is city-specific, is public library volumes per person, which indicates culture of literacy, how much people are investing in kind of a civic culture of literacy. Many of these libraries are also kind of associated with major research institutions as well that may have aided in terms of inventors. It all seems to suggest quite strongly that literacy, libraries, literary cultures are really important in terms of accounting for these regional differences. And I finally want to kind of conclude with a quote from James Henry Hammond, a very well-known enslaver from South Carolina, who said, quote, we may draw from every quarter of Europe and the North the full amount and precise kind of skill we may desire, with as much certainty as we could bring by order a cask of wine, a bale of woolens. And what Hammond is referring here to is that he's advocating for more manufacturing in the South. But his vision of manufacturing isn't that we need to generate more economic creativity within the South, but rather we are simply going to import economic creativity. And I think this is really important because I think this is an enduring theme of Southern economic history, is that economic creativity is not generated with indigenous institutions within the South, but rather tends to be imported from elsewhere. And this is one of the reasons I think that through much of the 19th and early 20th century, in the words of FDR, the South remains the nation's #1 economic problem. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there and very much looking forward to Lisa's comments.
So Lisa, click on Zoom.
Is somebody, oh, yeah, that's right. Of course, East Lansing always looks like this, especially this weekend. So anyway, thank you so much for this great paper, John. And it was a delight to read, always learn something interesting. So I really like this session, this entire session. It's so interwoven, and I hate that I am coming last. Paul Rhode stole a couple of my quotes from de Tocqueville, but that shows you how linked these papers are. This is a great session. So I'm not going to spend as much time on context as I was going to, because you heard a lot of this already, and most of you know this already. That there were, for example, earlier debates in economic history about slavery and its legacy for invention and innovation, or inventiveness and higher level thinking processes. For example, whether the repetitive tasks and other features of work assigned enslaved people dulled their thinking processes. This would have an effect not only on the enslaved people, but also on the slaveholders and the general culture and economy. This is what Paul Rhode's comment from de Tocqueville was also referring to. Such an environment, including the brutality, violence, and social organization of slavery, would not generally be conducive to free thinking, creativity, invention, and innovation. Further, patenting itself was a disincentive for enslaved people, as enslaved people could not be granted patents. In general, the U.S. government could not enter into contracts with enslaved people, and make the same argument about Soviet inventors in my work. So the conjecture and intuition are that slave cities were less inventive than free labor cities. And the central research question in this paper is, how did slave cities and free labor cities in the U.S. compare with respect to economic creativity in the 1850s? Now, John did a really good job of summarizing his own paper. It was very interesting and very clear. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on it. So the data he used were data from value-added manufacturing, from IPM's historical GIS, annual patent data from HISPAT, the 1860 census, and he was using population and the census of manufacturers. And he used the linkage of the 1860 census records to patentees, and notices that most were not from the slave cities. With respect to empirical methods, he again covered this fairly clearly and quickly, because we all do have to cover this quickly. He regressed his annual patents per million on value added in manufacturing, metro status, years since statehood, slave state status, illiteracy rate, and libraries. And this is at the county level. The findings were clear. All the correlates had the right sign. This is what is intuitive. This is consistent with my work. He was careful about causal claims, and we certainly have to be careful here. And of course, some of the explanatory variables might be correlated, like value added in manufacturing and the status of a city, the population of the city. Slavery itself could be, but you just have to be careful about the explanatory variables being correlated, among other things. But I think this was avoided for the most part. I'll say more about this in just a second. The findings challenge the new history of capitalism research. What I liked about the paper, of course, linking patents to census data is a great exercise and can inform our thinking about who innovates, how, and why. Even with the Nobel Prize, that's Paul Romer, an entire subfield of economics, the economics of innovation, the innovation process is still a black box. So anything we learn is an incremental addition to the stock of knowledge we have about the innovation process. These findings are consistent with what I find in my work on Confederate patents. The Confederate Commissioner of Patents declared when the Confederate Patent Office opened that the South would show that the industrial North, that the South was competitive with respect to invention and innovation with their own patent office. Southerners would obtain patents because they didn't trust the U.S. Patent Office. Enslaved people were given the right to patent in the Confederate States of America. In perusing the records of the Confederate Patent Office, I couldn't find any new innovation among Southerners, and I couldn't find any patents obtained by enslaved people. I'll say more about this in just a moment. The focus on libraries is warranted. My work suggests that the inability for African Americans to visit libraries, or the best libraries, was a result of Plessy versus Ferguson, that supported the separate but equal ruling and caused a dramatic fall in patenting around 1900. It was not only the patent digests and records that went missing, but it was also the chance opportunity to meet inventors at libraries. And this informal process was just as important as a formal process, because this was the golden age of independent inventors. What else could be done in this paper? Just a few things I would offer. The paper could corroborate the aforementioned work from the Confederate Patent Office and link census records to those patents. This isn't as daunting as one might think. Typically, when we're suggesting and volunteering researchers for more data collection, it's a daunting process, but there's so few of them. There are very few of them. I spent a day in the Museum of the Confederacy looking at these records, and I think it would require that kind of input. The corollary of John's research question is, was there any new invention and innovation, even in Confederate records? So did that have an effect? I mean, it's been a long time since I tried to do this, and I think that these records are probably digitized by now. But I think that this would be an interesting addition to the paper and would be useful for completeness. The paper, I think, should be careful about the role of education. During the period of interest, it is more important for inventors to be numerate, than literate. They needed to show that they could do calculations, and they weren't necessarily literate. Education started playing a bigger role with the advent of the corporate lab, which came into being in the late 1800s and early 1900s. For a discussion of great inventors and their educational background, for example, you could see Cook 2012 or Kahn and Sokoloff 2004. The paper discusses white inventors. What were enslaved inventors doing? They were inventing, surprisingly, but they were. But how were their inventions disseminated without access to the patent system? I mean, we know they were because of the cotton gin, the story of the cotton gin. And there is some literature on this. For example, Benjamin Montgomery's ship was produced by his slave owner, but it was never patented. It was put immediately into use in service of the Confederate Navy. So it would be interesting to understand the nuance and detail of what was happening with African American inventors. I think the paper could also take a lot more advantage of the literature and evidence related to networks and social capital that support innovation. I appreciate the example of the Franklin Institute and its library, which supported invention and its dissemination, as well as a contrast with the Charleston Library that supported the slaveholding gentry and not the production of knowledge. However, the library mechanism can have been more explicit and could be more explicit. For example, Ross Thompson's book, Structures of Change in the Mechanical Age, Technological Innovation in the U.S. 1790 to 1865, covers this period and shows how critical libraries and other institutions, typically in cities, were critical to supporting the scientific, social, and other networks needed for invention and innovation. You can see my 2010 review of this book or my 2012 paper comparing the social networks of great inventors, or my 2013 profile of great inventor Garrett Morgan. I didn't realize I referred to myself way too much here, but I would say that Sokoloff and Kahn and their work on great inventors, like I said, is is also revealing and does some of the same work here. But I really like the paper, and I think with these small changes, minor changes, I think it could be an even better paper. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. So we're over time, so I'd like to propose if people want to leave the room, they may without judgment. But if they would like to stay and our speakers are amenable doing so, we could have questions. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. I'll give everyone a second to sort and then. I'm not going to force you to stay. You could just say no questions and walk out of the room. And if people have questions, we'll still keep the Zoom audience involved. Austin, is that okay, or will we cut off automatically?
No, you won't be cut off automatically.
Come on up. All right, we're gonna have this microphone. That one isn't connected to anything apparently. All right, so we're gonna have our first question.
Okay, the audience here needs to liven up a little bit, so I'm gonna do my part. So the question is for Majewski's paper, and I'm wondering if there's a role for immigrants here, in the sense that the slave states received fewer immigrants and the non-slave states received lots more. And immigrants are outsiders, they bring in new ideas. And, Andrew Carnegie, libraries. And this, but there are also figures like Jan can't say it very well, Zilliger, of African descent, who invented the shoe lasting machine. So, outsider. He also was an immigrant. Anyway, John, immigration.
Yeah, and that
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it turns out that in a lot of these slave cities, there are more immigrants than you would suggest. So yes, as a region, as a whole, there are fewer immigrants in the South because urban overall urbanization rate is lower, and there are fewer immigrants in rural areas. But in places like New Orleans and Baltimore, you actually have lots of immigrants, and there is a fairly high share of immigrants who patent in southern cities, just as there are Northerners who patent in southern cities. What's missing are those native-born Southerners, and so in terms of the percentage of patents, it's a smaller number, of course, in these slave cities, but I would say that a higher percentage of their patents are actually done by immigrants, precisely because there are few native-born Southern inventors.
Yeah. I also have a question for, we're coming through okay? For John Majewski's paper. I was wondering about aspects of creativity that maybe don't involve either intellectual property rights or formal education so much, but one often associates with sort of slave and Black cultures in the South. I'm thinking of basically food culture and music. So for example, Memphis and New Orleans are both associated with music and with food culture. So I was wondering about those dimensions, and if in a way they would support your general theme, because when you have these other areas, it shows potential creativity in that aspect.
I absolutely agree. And so that there is like a highly creative component to Southern culture, whether it's Black culture, whether it's literary culture. So there are a number of prominent Southern authors in the 1840s and 1850s. Edgar Allan Poe would be like a prominent example. But yet you have this great outpouring of creativity in the South in many ways, which makes it all the more puzzling in my mind why there is such little commodification of that creativity within the South. And so there are Southern writers, but yet the publishing industry is located overwhelmingly in the North. There's a great Southern musical tradition, but the sheet music publishing industry is located overwhelmingly in the North. And so I think you're absolutely right. The South is this vibrant, creative region, but it doesn't translate into the same type of commodification of creativity than it does in northern cities.
so Lisa's going to be next.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry about that. Well, I don't know what happened, but the comment about the paper, the Burkus and NECA paper didn't show up, but exactly it's consistent with what was being said earlier. The Carnegie Libraries, there's a paper on the effect of Carnegie Libraries on invention and innovation. And I think that could be a useful addition to the paper as well.
I think that's great, and I think the literature that Lisa pointed me to in her comments, which were really super helpful, will really, I think, help deepen the paper and help me think more carefully. I think, especially about the education variable.
Other questions there? No, none more.
This question's for Warren. I really enjoyed the talk, and I look forward to reading the paper. And my plug would be for Robert Weaver on other pioneering Black economists, you put in there as well. But also, why is it helpful to think of these as race taxes instead of laws, or in addition to being laws, and maybe to get excitement out of economists for them? Look at it as a tax rather than a law, whether it be extra legal or informal or de facto or whatever. And I'm thinking about differentials in property prices in the color line, thinking of it as a tax. I have tried to wrap my head around it that way rather than a law, a race law. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing more about it.
Or do you want to answer and then ask the question?
That's my question.
Yeah. Or you can also answer the question or comment.
Yes, Robert Weaver. We should have included that in the list. A tax. I don't think that quite gets it. That I think won't tell us much about the lynching. I think that was Pritchett's point. I think in that particular case, the sort of Akerlof-Cranton models of identity economics, or the economics of identity, tells us a lot more, where people are wrapped up in their identities. And this could have been inherited from the slave days, but they're wrapped up in their identities, and they get their well-being from observing a world that conforms to what they think the world should be. And so if someone deviates from that, doesn't know his place, then all of those individuals are incentivized to do something about it. Okay, and so I think that's more to the point that we're trying to get at than tax. That would be sort of a norm, or that would be an identity, sort of putting in place a set of behaviors that in the end would reproduce the racism. Know your place. And we can do that. The political economy of it all, I think, allows that to happen, but under certain structural conditions. My question. Oh, newspapers and illiteracy. People can read a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, if you're reading, you could be reading the Bible, reading a psalm book. But what about newspapers? Newspapers are bringing news. They're bringing new information. I wonder what the circulation of newspapers are in the South, whether in a slave South, whether or not they were really open to discovery. They're just learning new things about the world.
And the newspapers are really fascinating, and your intuition is exactly right. So an important part of the publishing industry is newspapers. And many southern cities, of course, had newspapers or sometimes several newspapers, but in terms of the size and quality of the newspapers, northern cities were way, way ahead. And part of that, it could very well be related to fears about the dissemination of information in the South, the wrong kind of information. And so as the Civil War and secession and Civil War became increasingly evident in the late 1850s, there were like lynch mobs for people who had copies of the New York Tribune, for example, which was published by Horace Greeley and very anti-slavery. And there were censorship laws. It's a law in the South to advocate the abolition of slavery. And so that kind of culture that Lisa referred to in her comments is very much there in these southern cities. And so even though they have their own newspapers, it's a much less developed newspaper culture than in the North, which is developing these kind of regional newspapers, almost national newspapers like the New York Tribune.
Given that the plenary session starts in about 10 minutes, we should probably wrap it up and continue discussions either at the reception tonight or via email if people are on Zoom. I'd like to thank everyone for a really interesting panel. I easily could have listened to our speakers for 3 times as long and been interested to keep going, but they don't let us do that. So thank you, everyone.